Hi, this is David Oates from Veganism Unspun with a special report for plant-based news. Now, you may have seen stories like these circulating recently. The first such article came from the Quartz News website, which used the headline, "Being vegan isn't as environmentally friendly as you think." A headline which was later retracted in favour of the equally negative and misleading, "Being vegan isn't as good for humanity as you think." So just what on earth was journalist Chase Purdy talking about? Well, he was referring to this study conducted by researchers at the Friedman School of Nutrition Science and Policy, which, as the title implies, compared the carrying capacity of US agricultural land under 10 different dietary scenarios, one of which was veganism. But let's return to the Quartz article. As the headline suggests, Chase really stuck it to veganism here, claiming that when applied to an entire global population, the vegan diet wastes available land that could otherwise feed more people. However, even a cursory glance at the study itself tells us right there in the title that this model was not developed for a global population. It was based on the available agricultural land in the US, so the findings are only really applicable to 4.4% of the world's population, and give no indication of what diet would be the most efficient for the other 95.6% of people. And in fact, it doesn't even truly apply to the 4.4% of people who do live in the US either, since the study used a closed system model, which didn't account for the fact that the US currently imports a significant amount of its food, roughly £123 billion per year, which includes 35% of all its fresh produce consumption. So you really do need to look at land use in a global context to get any idea about the best way to feed people. And furthermore, the more people that this land could otherwise feed are imaginary people. This is because you can't feed more people than actually exist. You see, the various dietary models tested were found to be capable of feeding between 402 and 807 million people. That's between 1.3 and 2.6 times the actual population of the US. So even in the worst case scenario, no one's going hungry here, let alone for the vegan model, which would feed 735 million. And in case you were thinking, but the extra food could be exported to help hungry people worldwide. Well, if the model were applied worldwide, as the Quart article suggested it was, you'd get a similar result. It's estimated that 10 billion people could be fed on a healthy vegan diet just with the crops we already grow, out of a population of 7 billion. So there really are actually no more people who could be fed with any varying dietary models, even if the food could be theoretically produced. The Quartz article also included this graph, which appears to show that veganism is very middle of the pack when it comes to land use efficiency. But this isn't a graph from the study itself. The journalist Chase cooked this one up by himself using the study data, and it's very misleading. You see, the actual study graphs show in no uncertain terms that veganism is the most efficient land use system of all the models tested, requiring vastly less land per person. You see, the Quartz and all subsequent news articles confuse and conflate several concepts: environmentally friendly, environmentally sustainable, carrying capacity, and land use efficiency. And whilst these may all be related to a degree, the study only concerns itself with the latter two, finding that the vegan diet makes the most efficient use of land for agriculture by a large margin, far surpassing all other dietary models. It also vastly increased the US's carrying capacity compared to the current system. The only reason the vegan diet's most efficient use of land didn't translate to the highest carrying capacity is because of the current form of the US's land. You see, there's currently 299 million hectares of grazing land in the US, and the researchers assume that the vegan diet doesn't make any use of this, which it actually can. See Mike the Vegan's video on this for more information. But besides which, as we've already seen, it really doesn't have to, as you can feed more people than exist with our cropland alone. But if you create a theoretical dietary model, as the researchers did, which is primarily vegan, almost totally plant-based, but then also raise some cattle on that grazing land, then naturally you produce slightly more food, and hence the US was found to have a slightly higher carrying capacity under dietary models which contain small amounts of meat and dairy. However, this in no way equates to a more efficient use of land, and to demonstrate my point, I'd like to return to the graph presented in the Quartz article. And another reason why I said this graph was so misleading is because from the graph and its context in the article, you'd assume that this represents how many people could be fed with the same amount of land. However, in order to feed 735 million people, placing it 5th on Chase's list, the vegan diet required 95 million hectares of land. Whereas the omnivorous 40% diet, which is supposedly just ahead of the vegan diet in these rankings, feeds slightly more at 752 million, but to do so requires the use of over triple the land at 344 million hectares. That's the 95 million hectares of cultivated cropland which the vegan diet uses, as well as 35 million hectares of perennial cropland and 214 million hectares of grazing land. So over triple the land required for a mere 2% increase in the number of people fed. This is why it's so crucial to distinguish between carrying capacity and land use efficiency. Let me stress once again, the vegan diet was found to be the most land use efficient of all the dietary models. But because the US has some grazing land, this is a concept that the journalists in question found hard to grasp. And by the way, the 299 million hectares of grazing land in the US can be divided into pasture, rangeland, and woodland grazing land. And whereas the latter two are completely naturally occurring, the former is artificially maintained by the livestock industry. So the dietary models don't give an indication of the US's carrying capacity based on what land it naturally has, so much as based on what has been created to support its current appetites, making any figure for the carrying capacity of a given dietary model something of a self-fulfilling prophecy. Essentially, farmers created land that would be suitable for grazing, then researchers came along and said, since all this grazing land exists, we better graze on it to maximize the land's carrying capacity. They take the form of the land as some sort of static value, which it really isn't. It's the equivalent of building an artificial lake for a fish farm, then doing a survey of the land upon which it was built and concluding that it has a higher carrying capacity under a pescatarian dietary model than a vegan one. To further illustrate how fluid land use patterns can be, in 2007, 10 million hectares of cropland was lost, according to the US agricultural census data, because it was simply repurposed into pasture land. So if we add this 10 million hectares alone to the land available for the vegan dietary model, it could feed 812 million, meaning it would come out top of the pack, because by this point the other dietary models have already plateaued due to their fixed proportions of inefficiently produced animal products. But due to the appalling state of journalism in the West, not only do journalists like Chase totally misunderstand and misrepresent these studies, but their mistakes are then copied and pasted, reproduced by other journalists from all over the globe. Journalists such as Kyle Smith from the New York Post, for example, who fell so in love with the narrative of the Quartz story that he decided to use it rather than the study itself as the basis of his own story on the study, where he reproduced the same misleading and false information that was found in the Quartz article, whilst also finding time to call vegans selfish and embellishing further on the existing narrative, writing that vegans are the ones who are wreaking havoc on the planet compared to omnivores. Well, if by compared to omnivores you mean compared to purely theoretical, almost completely plant-based omnivores, and if by wreaking havoc you mean requiring the least land and hence having the smallest environmental impact, then yes, we are. But since he didn't read the study, no doubt the term omnivorous 40% was confusing to him, hence why he seems to believe himself to already be following a near-optimum diet for reducing one's environmental footprint, since he maintains a sensible ratio of animal and plant-based foods. What he doesn't realise is that omnivorous 40% doesn't mean 40% of your diet comes from animal foods, not even close. It refers to 40% of the level currently recommended by the US government, aka the omnivorous 100% group, which most people eat far in excess of in itself. Believe me, unless you're currently transitioning to a vegan diet, none of these models apply to you. But this kind of blind self-assuredness and general ignorance is to be expected from someone who goes on to argue that recycling is a pointless exercise reserved for global warming alarmists. But unfortunately, these kind of misrepresentations of the study's findings are being regurgitated by more and more media outlets by the day, with Vocative reporting that, contrary to everything your vegan friends have ever told you, the researchers found that 5 diets that contained the most meat were most efficient. Now, I found this one a little hard to work out. How could this sort of misconception arise? As we've seen, the most efficient dietary model was the vegan, and those with the highest carrying capacity were the vegetarian models, due to their extremely inefficient but nonetheless food-producing utilization of grazing land to produce dairy. And within the models which did include meat, to quote the researchers, reducing meat in the diet clearly resulted in increased carrying capacity. I mean, there's wrong and then there's just polar opposite. But perhaps most shockingly, The Guardian actually let the director of the International Livestock Research Institute write an article on the story for their website. I mean, why not just get Ronald McDonald himself? Was he busy? As you'd expect, he of course also reproduced the same misrepresentations of the study that I've examined so far, as befits his agenda, but he also managed to sneak in the idea that animal source food was, quote, vital for pregnant women, babies, and young children. This is an absurdist view, totally at odds with nutritional experts of the American and British Dietetics Association. But what do you expect when you give the fox the key to the hen house? He also tries to convince readers that livestock is essential for the world's poor, despite the fact that a meta-analysis of over 800 livestock schemes found that they time and again fail to benefit the poor, despite generating significant profits for the livestock industry, of course, and hence being successful in their own terms. But this isn't the first time that false stories like these have circulated. In 2015, IFL Science published an article with the headline, "Study claims being a vegetarian is worse for the environment than being a meat eater." However, investigations into the study found that it concluded nothing of the sort, forcing the website to backtrack, changing their headline to "How some healthy foods can be bad for the environment." This series of events is very reminiscent of the Quartz article's retraction of its original headline this time around. So why is this kind of misrepresentation happening? There are two primary factors at play here. First, veganism is growing and threatening certain powerful corporate interests. The research in question was funded by the Kellogg Foundation, which has strong ties to the livestock industry, having set up a major initiative to, quote, revise agricultural education and training in Africa. And this revision of education and training was aimed at creating a new generation of more competent future scientists who appreciate the vital importance of promoting the use of livestock in Africa. And then there's the Foundation's Communal Areas Indigenous Cattle Improvement Program in Zimbabwe, which in a very direct way supports the livestock industry through the donation of livestock to local people in an effort to expand herd sizes. The Kellogg Foundation also collaborates with the Consultative Group on International Agricultural Research, what I like to call CIGAR. I mean, that's seriously a missed opportunity there with the acronym. And CIGAR also happens to run the International Livestock Research Institute, the director of which, if you recall, wrote the Guardian article on the land use study. Which brings us neatly back to journalism. Journalism is in a dire state, especially when it comes to reporting on scientific studies. With journalists pumping out more stories than ever before, research is rushed if it's done at all. The immediacy of news is now valued more highly than its accuracy, which means that journalists are much more likely to simply reproduce a story from another news organisation than do any original research. On top of which, in the current climate, with the growing popularity and visibility of veganism, stories which portray veganism in a negative light also have significant news value. Articles like these are the journalistic equivalent of singing a lullaby to a child. They tell the reader that they're doing just fine, and there's no need to worry, and what could be more eminently readable than that? So the takeaway here is that whilst the journalists may not be equipped to tell you as much, and the animal agriculture industry certainly tries to hide it from you, veganism has once again been proven to be the most efficient way to feed the planet. And it's this land use efficiency which is so crucial if we are to have any chance of reversing or even just halting the ongoing destruction of our planet's last remaining wilderness areas and saving the countless animal species that inhabit them. This was David Oates of Veganism Unspun, reporting for Plant-Based News.